I want to look at several phases of history. To look briefly at the medieval period, then at what we call the early modern period, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th centuries, or what we call the Renaissance, and then the modern period. And when we come to the modern period, we will look at some of the great revolutions that took place in the 19th century in Cambridge and elsewhere, that produced the present-day modern form of the university with its big base in research, especially. Now, one can think of universities, of course, as pursuing studies for their own sake, because of simple human curiosity, the need to know, the want to know, and also for the passing on, the communication of culture, the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. But as well as this, we can think of universities as always having had other, more utilitarian purposes, more purposes that are useful to the wider society. Study for curiosity and to convey culture is immensely important, but it does not have direct utility. But what counts as utility, what we call useful, changes with time. In the Middle Ages, Europe was dominated by the Christian religion and the institutions of the church. And so a university was useful in the sense of training and educating the clergy, the ministers of religion, the priests of the Christian religion. So the usefulness lay in service to the church, which was one of the great institutions of medieval Europe, just as powerful as kings and princes. Well, another kind of usefulness is usefulness to the state. A university can function to train an elite of technocrats, of politicians, of people who understand the workings of society, institutions, politics, and so can become leaders of administration. Or, in the Renaissance, they became courtiers of kings and princes. Courtiers, people, educated people, who were around the kings and princes and helped serve them as ambassadors and as advisors. Or again, in the modern world, we can have yet another type of usefulness, usefulness to the economy. The university today, everywhere on the globe, is under great pressure to be useful in helping national economies, in having direct transfer of information and knowledge between research and industry and the economy. So there are several different conceptions of usefulness, of utility, through the centuries. The universities in Europe began in the 12th century, the 1100s. Already we begin to see a small beginning of secularization, which is a theme that I will come to later on. In other words, a beginning, a small beginning, of a separation of education from the church. Because before there were universities, higher education took place in the monasteries, in the places where the monks gathered. For example, the great monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, which became famous in the Second World War because it was bombed during the war. These great monasteries were the homes of learning before universities. And then came the first universities of Europe, in Oxford, in Cambridge, in Bologna in Italy, and in France at the Sorbonne in Paris, and at Montpellier on the south coast of the Mediterranean. These are some of the very early universities. And they begin to specialize in some studies that were not directly for the church, the study of law and the study of medicine. These two great professions were taught in universities from a very early time. If you walk around the Cambridge colleges today, you still see some visual echoes, some visual architectural representations of the monasteries of the earlier world. The cloisters, the enclosed courtyards, the staircases, these were rather similar to where the monks would have taught in the monasteries. I mentioned Cambridge and Oxford, and it is important to say that until quite modern times, the 19th century, there were only two universities in the whole of England, Cambridge and Oxford. Today there are over 100, but that growth has been almost entirely during the past century. England had a very elite system of education in the universities with just two. Other countries had a broader tradition, a more democratic tradition of admission. Other countries, including Scotland, for we need to remember that Scotland was a different nation from England. Perhaps in 30 years' time it will again be a different nation from England. But for many centuries, Scotland had 4 universities. Smaller country, but twice as many universities. A much more democratic system where many more ordinary people were able to get a higher education. Now, the medieval university had studies, most of which were very unlike, different from our own. There was not a concept of research, of expanding knowledge, of knowledge that continues to grow and grow. There was more a concept of the transmission of culture that I have already spoken of a pre-existing, an already existing body of knowledge that came from the ancient world and was continued and passed on to each generation. Much of the teaching consisted of explaining, of being an expositor, exposition of ancient texts, carrying on the truths of the ancient world. And the truths of the ancient world were of 2 broad groups: religious, the Bible, the Christian Bible, Judeo-Christian Bible, and the works of the great theologians of the early Christian church, like St. Augustine. So much of the study in the universities was very much theological, religious, concerned with understanding Scripture or the Bible, the great book of Christianity. However, the other great group of texts, ancient texts, were classical Greek and Roman texts. Most especially Aristotle, the greatest, the most encyclopedic of the philosophers of ancient Greece, whose authority remained enormous for many, many centuries. A great deal of science, a great deal of knowledge about the natural world was derived from the writings of Aristotle.